We deal with episodic psychosis in all types of mental disorders so far referred to as obsessive-compulsive disorders. If we have an insufficient anxiety emotional intelligence, a sudden eruption of the anxiety triggers a natural psychotic response in the form of episodic psychosis. The episodic psychosis usually takes the form of a psychotic ritual. Thus, the episodic psychosis situation may be, for example, triggered by locking the door, resulting in a ritualistically repeated checking and making sure that the door was actually locked. There is no doubt that in this case we are dealing with the episodic psychosis. The psyche of the type 3 people presents in such a moment a definitive sign of a psychotic state, which is the functioning regardless the actual reality, what is actually the definition of psychosis. In a normal reality, turning the key in the lock and checking once that the door is closed is enough to perform and verify the act of closing the door. Meanwhile, the type 3 people in such a situation experience the anxiety attack in front of which the anxiety emotional intelligence is helpless. By the type 3 people, a natural mechanism of decompression in the form of episodic psychosis turns on in such a temporary anxiety overload. And then the anxiety perception disappears. No one can doubt the psychotic nature of such a ritual. It means the two basic criteria of the psychosis. First, a detachment from the reality, and second, substitution for the anxiety. Psychosis always replaces anxiety. Another example of the episodic psychosis in the anxiety emotional intelligence imbalance situation is the paroxysmal hand washing or washing clothes beyond reasonable motives. Of course, the rituals of the episodic psychosis are often extremely exhausting physically and mentally, but evidently, from the nature's point of view, it's a price worth paying to stop the anxiety. Apparently, the nature doesn't like the anxiety and fights it in every possible way. First, the primary psychosis, then the episodic psychosis, then the negative primary psychosis known as depression, and finally the complete exclusion of anxiety, which is the unipolar psyche known as autism. The obsessive-compulsive disorder, that's the episodic psychosis, has been so far in an incomprehensible way classified as an anxiety disorder in the psychiatric systematics. It's, however, as I have shown above, a psychotic disorder. The episodic psychosis may have a wider range of possible psychosis scenarios than just the obsessive-compulsive disorder. Another possible of the episodic psychosis is, for example, a hysterical attack or a panic attack. In this case, the three episodic psychosis criteria are met. First, the reality detachment. Second, the anxiety replacement. And the third, the episode's short duration. Apart from the above mentioned, the type 3 individuals have developed another method of masking and neutralizing anxiety, a method that is extremely surprising and one might even say beyond the framework of any psychology or psychiatry. I am referring now to a phenomenon of a strange psychosis which is manifested not by the psyche, but by the somatic organism. In other words, what we are dealing with is a derealization of the somatic and not of the mental function. We can therefore risk saying that we are dealing here with a kind of a somatic psychosis. To avoid confusion with the mental psychosis, it's justified to use for such a phenomenon the expression somatosis. Thus, as in the case of the episodic psychosis, for example, the obsessive-compulsive disorder discussed earlier, the somatic psychosis, so somatosis, also occurs in the psyche overload situation when the anxiety outweighs the anxiety emotional intelligence. The type 3 people develop a mechanism then that replaces the anxiety in the form of a somatosis or somatic psychosis. The somatosis is not as short as it was the case of the episodic psychosis. It can take several hours, days, or even longer. The somatosis manifests in a variety of ways. It can be in the form of squinting or frowning. It can also be sniffling. It can also be an increased need to go to the toilet, even every few minutes, mainly to pass little or no urine, but it can also be an attempt to defecate. The somatic psychosis or somatosis include also the eating psychosis like anorexia and bulimia. Here, the anxiety is also replaced either by a psychotic act in the form of eating despite being full, bulimia, or by a psychotic act of giving up food despite the starvation, as is the case of anorexia. In all examples of the somatic psychosis, somatosis, the most important criterion of psychosis, the reality detachment, is met. In other words, all these acts are performed despite the lack of an organic justification for them. Thus, the type 3 people sniff despite the absence of any nasal irritation and discharge, blink their eyes for no physical reason, run to the toilet every few minutes with an empty bladder. Finally, in the case of anorexia, the type 3 people do not eat food despite physical hunger, or, as in the case of bulimia, indulge in an unrestrained consumption of food despite being physically full. As we can see, there can be no doubt about the psychotic nature of these acts. Type 3 humanity has an always ready to start mechanism of the psychosis, which relieves the overload situation in the anxiety emotional intelligence ratio. Of course, this doesn't work when desired. Type 3 people do not switch the psyche by the force of their will from the anxiety emotional mode to the psychotic mode. Nevertheless, knowing better and better over time the circumstances in which anxiety overload occurs, the type 3 people may plan the activities in such a way as to either avoid these circumstances or be prepared for the occurrence of the somatic psychosis when the latter cannot be avoided. There is one more type of somatosis that plays the same role in the type 3 people as the aforementioned somatosis and the episodic psychosis. This time, however, the psychotic activity is shown not by a person as a whole, but by the specific organs of the body. And so this will be a coughing without inflammation of the airways, diarrhea without a physiological cause, and itchy skin, itching eyes, and watery eyes without any irritation, and many other reality detached ailments of other organs, and thus manifesting a psychotic dysfunction. Importantly, in contrast to the two previous psychoses, which showed an episodic nature, and each episode of the psychosis was triggered by an overload in the anxiety emotional intelligence ratio, this type of the somatosis is also a type of the somatic psychosis, also episodic, but the manifestations of this somatosis will not depend on the anxiety emotional intelligence ratio each time the somatic manifestation happens. This type of somatosis does start during a very severe anxiety overload in early adolescence in the age of 15 to 25, but all subsequent episodes of this somatic psychosis are independent of the emotional intelligence ratio. Hence, we will refer to it as the chronic somatosis. 2. And once activated, the chronic somatosis is rapidly chronic, but unlike simple somatosis, the subsequent manifestations are not triggered by the episodes of the anxiety overload. The hypothesis of mental genesis of many somatic diseases is already widely accepted in all medicine. In highly civilized countries of the world, more and more patients are treated in clinics and hospitals, which are psychosomatic clinics and hospitals. This is a direction in the development of medical care, which is particularly desired by the type 3 people suffering from the chronic somatosis. While it's not difficult to understand the mechanism of the formation of the episodic psychosis and that of the somatosis, where the psychosis substitutes the anxiety in almost visually verifiable way, it's difficult, however, to comprehend how chronic physical disease can be a substitute for the anxiety, as it's in the case of the chronic somatosis. How does the mental processes of the anxiety transformation, how does the mental processes of the anxiety transform into a physiological and pathophysiological processes? In addition, how is it possible for a single anxiety overload, even a very big one, to have such a lifelong effect in the form of an activated pathophysiological process? The answer to this question next time. Thank you.